June 4th, 1943. A slow train creaked its way across the plains of Texas under the blistering sun. Inside one of the passenger coaches, Obergefreiter Werner Burkhardt, a captured veteran of the Afrika Korps, sat quietly staring out the window. He clutched a small notebook, his hidden diary, concealed beneath his tunic. As the train pulled into the small town of Mexia, Burkhardt scribbled a line that trembled with disbelief. The Americans must be lying. No nation at war could possess such abundance. Just hours earlier, he and 1,849 fellow German prisoners had arrived in the United States, not in the cattle cars they feared, but in cushioned Pullman coaches, complete with sleeping bunks and dining cars. Outside the windows, electric lights blazed across the countryside. Shops were lit. Homes had lights on in every room. In Germany, blackout curtains had veiled every window since 1940. Many rural areas still lacked electricity altogether. What Burkhardt saw was more than illumination. It was disorientation. How could a nation fighting a global war still live like this? To these German prisoners, battle-hardened, propagandized, and certain of Nazi Germany's technological superiority, the United States appeared like a mirage. Yet this was no illusion. From the very moment they stepped foot on American soil, they began a journey that would not just challenge their ideology, but unravel it, strand by strand. The shock began at the docks in Oran, Algeria, where prisoners had first been processed by American forces. Within hours, the Americans had photographed, cataloged, and examined thousands of prisoners. Medical exams were given, vaccines administered, identity cards issued. And all of this was conducted with calm professionalism, delivered in fluent German by American officers trained for this exact task. Hans Miller, an Oberrichter with the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote home that the Americans had fed them white bread, fresh meat, and hot coffee while they waited for transport. At first, the prisoners thought it was a manipulation tactic, propaganda. But it wasn't. It was standard military rations. Then came the ships, the Liberty ships. What to the German soldiers looked like miracles of steel and speed were, in truth, mass-produced workhorses of American industry. One prisoner overheard a sailor mention that the ship they were sailing on had been built in 4 days. 4 days. In Germany, such claims would have been dismissed as delusional lies. But in America, they were a matter of routine. Over 2 weeks on the Atlantic, German soldiers experienced the second wave of psychological shock. They watched American sailors toss half-eaten steaks overboard, discard loaves of bread, pour out unused milk. Waste on this scale wasn't just unheard of, it was inconceivable to men raised in rationed economies. And yet, the Americans weren't doing it to mock them. They did it because they could. Because they had so much, they didn't need to measure every slice. As the ship neared the East Coast, the scale of American industrial might become undeniable. Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, a Prussian aristocrat and career officer, recalled watching the radar dish rotate on the bridge. He had assumed such technology was rare even among Allied nations. Instead, it was standard equipment, even on cargo vessels. He wrote later, "In that moment, I knew Germany had lost the war." When they arrived at Norfolk Naval Base, the transformation accelerated. German soldiers who had once marched with pride through Paris now gawked at cranes lifting cargo with seamless efficiency, electric machines working in unison, and cars, so many cars, that it seemed every dockworker owned one. In Germany, only the elite or party members had vehicles. Here, ordinary laborers commuted in their own automobiles. And then came the trains, the ones that would take them across America, into the heartland, into the future. Not cramped boxcars, but Pullman coaches with padded seats and white tablecloth dining cars. Air conditioning hummed through the cars. When one broke, an American sergeant apologized to prisoners of war. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, an electrical engineer before the war, tried to calculate how much electricity the single train station used. He gave up. The waste, he wrote, was magnificent. It was the waste of infinite supply. For 3 days, the trains rolled through Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and beyond. The prisoners stared at illuminated towns, full shelves in store windows, and factories running 3 shifts a day. One wrote, "Every village here had more light than all of Hamburg." They passed through towns where gas stations offered cold soda. Electric fans spun in train depots. Billboard signs for refrigerators and radios dotted the roadsides. They watched American life, not curated, not sanitized, but real. Working people with goods and machines, living at a standard they'd been told was impossible. The most jarring discovery was not technological, it was social. In many places, the guards didn't bark orders. They were courteous. The American soldiers joked, answered questions, even showed sympathy. When a prisoner dropped his canteen, a guard picked it up for him. The idea that an enemy soldier would show decency to a German was more damaging to Nazi ideology than any bombing raid. And the journey was only just beginning. The morning sun rose above Camp Hearn in Texas, stretching its rays across bunks and barracks that housed men once celebrated as warriors of the Reich. These German prisoners of war, caught in the collapse of North Africa and then transported across the ocean, now found themselves in a place that defied every expectation. Camp Hearn had been built in just 4 months. The barracks were wooden, yes, but each one had electricity, hot showers, flush toilets. Some of the medical facilities rivaled German civilian hospitals. As Obersturmbannführer Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, later remembered, "I stepped into the X-ray room and expected the smell of antiseptic and hopelessness. Instead, I found modern equipment, trained staff, and reassurance. In Germany, frontline hospitals had been under constant threat. Supply lines cut, medicine scarce, and war wounds piled higher than the medical corps could handle. Here, in the heart of America, enemy soldiers received care not as captives, but as patients. They learned quickly that the ideological machines they'd been trained to serve were disintegrating beneath the reality of capture. The prisoners were marched out of the barracks in columns, each man assigned to a labor detail. Many believed they would be forced into cruel, degrading work, or worse. But the assignments were like nothing they anticipated. Fields, factories, farms, all places where they could see, hear, and touch American productivity. One group worked at a cotton gin outside Houston. Unterscharführer Herbert Lang from East Prussia recalled, "A single machine processed more cotton in 1 hour than our village could do in a month." Lang glanced at the farmer's son who operated the machine. The teenager wore simple work clothes, drove a tractor worth more than everything Lang's father had earned in a lifetime. When Lang remarked this, the boy shrugged and said he was just waiting for his next John Deere model. Lang's diary entry ended. "I was taught to think I was superior. Instead, I was taught to look upward." Meanwhile, in the Midwest, other prisoners counted combine harvesters, massive fields, and grain elevators that stretched as far as the eye could see. Gefreiter Franz Weber, assigned to sugar beet fields in Nebraska, logged in his notebook, "The machine harvests 100 acres today. My division had 80 acres last year, manually." He watched tractors pull through fields that once belonged to entire German counties, their work done in hours rather than weeks. The sense of human insignificance built up like static electricity. You believed you mattered, then you saw a machine that worked without you. In New Jersey, at a Campbell's soup facility, Prisoners witnessed a conveyor system that moved tomatoes and cans with speed and precision they had never known. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, previously a food processing plant supervisor in Germany, compared notes. "In our plant, 50 men did the work one woman did here, and she drank coffee while monitoring it. The factory ran 3 shifts, women and older men working while younger men fought overseas. The output exceeded peacetime German capacities, yet no bombs were needed. Just gears, belts, electricity, and discipline. This wasn't war production alone. It was war infrastructure." At the Rubbertown complex near Louisville, 4 massive synthetic rubber plants brought online in just 18 months produced 800,000 tons of rubber annually, while Germany struggled to reach 120,000 tons. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist drafted into IG Farben before the war, watched the distillation towers and catalytic crackers with the realization heavy on his tongue. We built the process. They built volume. The war was lost when they began consuming what we couldn't produce. Every site the prisoners visited chipped away at the myth of Nazi supremacy. Everywhere they looked, they saw a civilian economy turn to war, but without the desperation. They saw women welding, teenagers running drills, African American workers operating heavy machinery, all contributing to a war effort that could outproduce armies. The prisoner letters and diaries recorded a pattern of disbelief turning into resignation and then into questions. In one camp newspaper, once defiant demands for repatriation changed into essays about democratic reconstruction and what Germany must learn. The educational programs in the camps accelerated the mental unraveling. American professors and German refugee scientists conducted classes on democracy, economics, political theory, even atomic physics for captured German officers. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm Braun, formerly of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures at Camp Shelby on modern science taught by Jewish refugee scholars. He wrote, later, "This was forbidden knowledge for us in Germany. We were told it was inferior. Here it was superior, and they gave it away. Even more telling were the interactions between guards and prisoners. The Germans expected contempt, cruelty, discipline. Instead, they found courtesy. At one camp, the Methodist Church choir sang carols in German for the captives during Christmas 1943. The same captives were invited to dinner by local townspeople just a few weeks later. Corporal Paul Fisher, convicted of Panzer Grenadier casualties, described the scene. "We sat in a cotton gin worker's living room. The man's son was at the front in France. Yet his family treated us like guests. His mother asked if we wanted seconds, that shell of superiority cracked like hollow aluminum. On the supply side, the observations were even more devastating. As the trains rolled through Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, prisoners saw towns lit up like cities, electric fans spinning in depots, parking lots full of cars, even on midnight service shifts. One engineer, Oberrichter Hans Müller, calculated that the railway yard they passed used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire Berlin district did in a day. He wrote simply, "The waste was magnificent." And then there was the moment of truth. In August 1944, during the Normandy campaign, thunderbolts, tanks, trucks, and supplies poured into Europe at tidal scale. But for the men in American camps, the realization came earlier. On one snowy evening, something broke in their minds. The war lost meaning. The enemy became more abstract than ever. In studies post-war, scholars dubbed it ideological collapse syndrome. German prisoners stopped defending the Reich's slogans and racial myths. They simply asked, when did we lose? And how? It was not bullets that shattered their beliefs. It was abundance. It was logistics. It was a society so organized, productive, and intense that it made the bombers look like toys. They witnessed civilian economy turn to martial stream, yet still human, still at peace. They had believed in racial hierarchy, in Aryan engineering, in German destiny. They found a nation that treated its enemies with code, food, care, and counted no cost for doing so. In their journals they wrote, "We have lost the war, not at the front, but in our minds." Reichsleiter Hermann Göring might have commanded Luftwaffe, but here the real sovereign was production. They learned that a steel plant could outlast a bomber squadron, that a tractor field could feed more troops than an invasion force could destroy. That kind treatment of enemies could win hearts faster than propaganda ever could. This realization didn't come all at once. It came mile by mile, factory by factory, including the broken dreams of desert veterans. The German war machine had collapsed under bombardment, but more importantly, under observation. These men carried metallic scars of defeat. Yet what haunted them afterward was not the loss of tanks or aircraft. It was the truth of industry, freedom, and possibility. And for the American guards, the farmers, the factory workers, the unsung millions of laborers and engineers, this was the true front line. Not the skies above Europe, but the assembly lines, the power plants, the farms and the towns lit up at night. The captured soldiers of the Reich became unwitting witnesses to the greatest demonstration of industrial and moral power in human history. By the time the last trains returned to Germany in 1946, these prisoners left not just as former foes, but as ambassadors of a different future. Their enemy had won, not just on the battlefield, but in the factory, the farm, and the dormitory. Their defeat became a lesson, not in might, but in meaning. And in this lesson, America found its greatest victory. The summer of 1944 was not just a turning point in the battlefields of Europe. It was a turning point in the minds of the men captured and transported to the United States. As the trains carried them deeper into America, every mile peeled away the certainty of Nazi propaganda, layer by layer. In one sleepless night aboard the train, Unterfeldwebel Karl Meisinger counted the lights of one small Kentucky town. Electric street lamps, neon signs, homes where every room glowed. In Germany, he scribbled in his journal, we had to choose which room got light. Here they wasted it. By the time they arrived at the camps, the full shock had arrived. At Camp Hearn, Texas, and elsewhere, the prisoners found not only basic comforts, but easier access to leisure, to books, to mail, to schooling. The very environment was a message. The barracks were clean, the meals were varied, the uniforms serviceable, leisure hours allowed. In one scholar's survey, 95% of German POWs rated their treatment as good or excellent. The Washington Post +2 fold 3 HQ +2. Many German soldiers, raised on the idea that weak, decadent Americans were incapable of sustaining war, now faced a devastating alternative. A people at war who seemed unburdened by war. On August 6th, when word reached the camps of the Normandy landings, the prisoners looked across the fences at American workers loading trucks, dispatching shipments, sorting supplies, and they began to ask quietly, how could they win if they looked like this? The labor assignments given to the prisoners added fuel to this internal reckoning. At sugar beet fields in Nebraska, at cotton gins near Houston, at Camp Clinton in Mississippi, German soldiers worked alongside tractors, combines, and harvest machinery. One former farm boy from Bavaria recalled watching a tractor press through 100 acres of wheat, while his entire German platoon had labored manually for 3 days on half as much land. He wrote, "The work we did was easier than fighting. Yet the work we watched was harder, but invisible." Mishistory.now.m.ms.gov +1 factories told the same story. At a Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, prisoners described women who pressed buttons, elderly men who operated conveyors, youngsters driving forklifts. In Germany, we feared machines, Grimm, a former metallurgist, recorded. Here the machines trusted them. He noted the irony. German workers had built the machines. Americans used them with ease. In many camps, mechanical precision outpaced military precision. In the evenings, lectures and classes filled the mess halls. Engineering professors from American universities, Jewish refugees, scientists once barred from German labs. They taught topics like atomic physics, industrial economics, democratic government. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm Braun, once of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, wrote that the lectures felt like heresy at first, then like a promise. Under the barbed wire, men who had sworn allegiance to Hitler now debated the virtues of free markets, labor rights, and civilian innovation. The physical transformation of their bodies, food, clothing, light, was matched by a mental transformation of questioning and doubt. The Washington Post +1. The psychological weight of all this was enormous. One term used after the war by U.S. intelligence analysts was ideological collapse syndrome, the idea that witnessing an enemy society thriving amid war could break belief systems more effectively than bullets. German POWs began to lash out less. They asked fewer ideological questions. The fanatic element in many camps dwindled. Instead, the most common request made by prisoners was access to American newspapers, to books, to canteen privileges. They wanted not just survival, they wanted explanation. On a cold December night in 1943, the local Methodist church near a Texas camp hosted a Christmas dinner for the prisoners. Carols were sung in German. Wives and mothers of American soldiers served meals. One prisoner wrote, "We were enemies. They treated us like sons." He wondered, if this was how Americans treated their prisoners, what did they do for their own soldiers? That question would haunt him long after he returned home. The material evidence they consumed every day spelled it out. Trucks, tanks, supplies rolled off American production lines in numbers that made German logistics look archaic. Synthetic rubber plants, aluminum refineries, assembly lines, all visible to the men who once believed the Reich was unmatched. At one Midwest plant paired with German prisoners, steel output exceeded the German national capacity by 30%. In countless letters home, phrases popped up. We were told we were superior. They proved we were redundant. By spring 1945, the change was noticeable. Camp newspapers, produced by the prisoners themselves, shifted tone. In the earlier newsletters, the content was firefights, ideology, defiance. By 1945, the themes had shifted. Vocational training, correspondence courses, plans for post-war Germany. Many German officers volunteered for enhanced labor assignments, spoke of emigration to America, or studied English with vigor. The camp fences held fewer captives of ideology and more men of ambition. The final blow to their illusions came when they were repatriated. In 1946, many returned to a Germany in ruins. Yet some of the men who walked off American soil carried inside them something new, a blueprint. They'd seen assembly plants, they'd seen tractors, they'd seen families eating meat weekly. They'd seen that victory could be made, not just fought. One post-war German ambassador reflected, "We came here as prisoners. We left with ideas." And those ideas helped reconstruct a nation. West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, forged in factories, helped by American aid, was populated in part by former POWs who brought practical knowledge and respect for free labor. They didn't carry hatred, they carried experience. The American experiment had become a countermodel to Nazi myth, and the men who witnessed it were its unwitting heralds. So while the bombs of Europe took lives, the quiet hum of American electricity took minds. While tanks rolled in France, Factory belts rolled in Illinois. While generals argued doctrine, American towns produced tractors, trucks raced across the moonscape of fields. German soldiers captured in Tunisia ended up watching this silent demonstration, and their defeat became something more than military. It became existential. They had believed in victory. They found machines that outlasted war. They believed in power by conquest. They found power by production. They believed in fear and suppression. They found liberty and abundance. The war ended in Europe in May 1945, but in the hearts of those who watched, the war ended much earlier. And the greatest victory was not against an enemy army. It was against an enemy idea. As autumn drew on in 1944, the invisible walls around the German prisoners began to close in, not physically but mentally. Captured veterans of the Afrika Korps, men who had believed themselves part of an unstoppable machine, were now seeing the fissures in that machine crack wide open. The creeping awareness grew in quiet moments. At the mess hall, in the library, while working alongside American civilians. It was one thing to lose a battle. It was another to lose belief. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the barracks were more than shelters. They were classrooms of contradiction. The camp hospital boasted X-rays, penicillin, trained staff. Former German officers who had cared for twice wounded soldiers found themselves treated as patients with dignity. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, former chief surgeon of the German 164th Light Division, later wrote, "I expected wounds, suffering, bare beds. Instead, I found comfort, care, and competence I thought reserved for our elite." Outside the camp fences, the world remained bewilderingly prosperous. The trains that had carried men into captivity traversed landscapes of electric lights, mechanized farms, and night shift factories. On one rail stop in Tennessee, Unterfeldwebel Hans Müller counted diesel trucks, lighted service stations, a parking lot full of cars. In Germany, he wrote, "We dreamed of tractors. Here every farm has them. Labor assignments amplified the breakdown of old beliefs. In Nebraska's sugar beet fields, men who had trained to kill found themselves feeding Americans and being fed themselves in return. Gefreiter Franz Weber, made to harvest hundreds of acres alongside machines, recalled the difference. In Africa, we climbed into trucks while others went on foot. Here the machines did the work, and we watched. The realization sat heavy. German warfare had been brute force. American production was relentlessness. Factories told a similar story. At a Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, prisoners described conveyor systems, women operating heavy machines, drill presses running day and night. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, previously a supervisor in a German food processing plant, compared notes. "In our plant, the machine served us. Here, the machine replaced us." The irony was sharp. The German believers in tech supremacy had been out-patented, out-produced, and out-endured. In the evenings, the camp mess halls filled with a different kind of sound, the scratch of pencils, the hum of lectures, the voice of professors, engineering, economics, democracy, subjects once forbidden, now offered under guard towers. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm Braun, former researcher at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, entered a class taught by a Jewish refugee scientist. He wrote, "They taught what we never learned and expected nothing in return." The shift was subtle but profound. The war wasn't ended by bullets alone. It was ending in minds. This was what historians later called ideological collapse syndrome. The term described prisoners who, instead of fighting propaganda, saw reality. They watched the foe they'd been taught to despise succeed, not in spite of war, but because of its logic. They ceased defending slogans and began asking, "Why did we lose?" The answer came not from interrogations, but from observation. Smithsonian Magazine, +2, Wikipedia, +2, one frost cold December night. Something happened that nothing in Europe could have delivered. At the local Methodist church near Camp Hearn, American citizens hosted a Christmas dinner for the German captives. Carols were sung in German. Wives of soldiers served homemade cakes. The prisoners sat not behind wire, but as guests. Corporal Paul Fisher, former Panzer Grenadier, recalled, "We were enemies. They treated us like sons." The emotional rupture of Nazi racial mythology was complete. What kind of people treat their enemies this way, and with such confidence? Meanwhile, on railroads and highways, the evidence of America's difference was relentless. A train yard in Virginia hummed with electric fans. Billboard signs blinked on highways at midnight. Parking lots overflowed. Engineer Oberrichter Hans Müller attempted a calculation. The yard consumed more electricity in 1 hour than his Berlin district did in a day. He stopped writing. "The waste was magnificent," he scribbled. That waste wasn't just waste, it was weaponized proof. In spring 1945, as Allied armies advanced into Germany, some former POWs watched their homeland collapse from across the Atlantic. They knew that the war wasn't over because they were back. It was over because everything they believed had stopped working. Camp newspapers reflected it. Once padded with defiance, now ran articles on vocational training, immigration, democratic labor. The fences remained, but the walls, in their minds, crumbled. The material recounting of output stunned them. From rubber plants producing 800,000 tons a year in America versus Germany's 120,000, machines that carried more than men, tractors that harvested more acres than entire divisions, dug trenches. Each statistic was another nail in a coffin made of ideology. A menial story. In Kansas City, they stopped at a cattle stockyard. The air smelled of beef, fresh, thick, American. German POWs who had eaten maybe 200 grams of meat a week in Africa now saw workers eating sandwiches loaded with it. One guard bought 20 hamburgers, paid with a $1 bill, all for prisoners. That moment burned like truth. Back in the camps, some of the men volunteered for labor programs. Why? Not for less punishment, but for more insight. They signed up for the English classes, for correspondence at the University of Chicago or Stanford University extension courses. They filled out vocational forms. They signed letters home describing America as logical, organized, free. Many believed their defeat began not on a battlefield, but in an engineering plant or at a classroom desk. The most poignant moment came at liberation. When they returned to Germany in 1946, some of the veterans who'd landed in Texas, Nebraska, Michigan never went back as Nazi soldiers. They came back as students of democracy. Ambassador Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, later wrote, "We came as conquerors. We left with ideas." Wikipedia +1. Their transformation seeded Germany's economic miracle. American production didn't just defeat Nazis, it redesigned a future. The machines they saw, the treatment they received, the freedom they observed, they carried home not resentment, but recognition. War industries became peacetime industries. The captives became citizens. This section of history reminds us, wars are not only won in the trenches or air raids or naval battles. They are won in production lines, in schools, in how you treat a captured soldier. The uniforms of the Krauts were replaced by aprons of workers, the tanks by tractors, the guns by textbooks. The war ended when the ideology broke, and the light switched on. As this story enters our present, remember the faces behind the fences. The young German lieutenant placing his first dollop of ice cream into a bowl. The African-American worker in the diner who served enemies he was fighting with. The Midwest farmer harvesting acres no army could hold. They were all part of the same narrative. For in Europe, the bombs crumbled cities. But across the Atlantic, quiet factories never stopped. Towns never darkened. Farms never halted. And behind it all, the German captives watched and learned, and the greatest irony of all, that the strongest weapon of the Allies was not a bomber or a tank, but a lesson made visible. Their defeat became gospel. Their captivity became mentorship. And America's industrial might became more than an arsenal. It became a teacher. The final months of American captivity for German POWs did more than mark the end of wartime service. They marked the start of a deeper transformation. By mid-1945, the fences remained. The uniforms still read PW, but the minds behind them were changing. What began with bewildered disbelief in a nation at war became a reluctant acknowledgement of a society at peace, and with it a personal reckoning for men trained to dominate. One of the most illuminating shifts took place not on the battlefield, but in the camp newspaper. In early 1944, many POW camp journals still echoed defiance. Articles about missing comrades, Nazi victories, longing for home. But by late 1944 and into 1945, the tone shifted. At Special Projects Division, the segment of the U.S. Army that oversaw re-education efforts for German prisoners, facilitators noted a dramatic uptick in submissions. Essays about what to build, what to learn, what to plant, not what to destroy. ObservableHQ.com +2 JSTOR.org +2 AT Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, the POW-run German-language newspaper Der Ruf, The Call, launched in March 1945 and reached over 75,000 copies across camps. It offered German prisoners a platform for essays on reconstruction, democracy, and free enterprise. It allowed them to ask questions for the first time. What happens after surrender? How will Germany rebuild? Not as a defeated power, but as a partner. Wikipedia, a former Oberleutnant held in Texas, later recalled, "I subscribed to Der Ruf because someone handed it to me. I expected lies. Instead, I found plans for factories, for farms, for citizens." He paused. The irony, I sat behind wire reading a plan for freedom. The transition from passive observer to potential agent of change came swiftly for some. Camp labor programs, farms, factories, refineries, taught lessons the Wehrmacht never did. At a rubber plant near Louisville, prisoners saw towers of synthetic rubber churn 800,000 tons annually, while Germany had labored toward 120,000 tons at best. A chemist drafted from E.G. Farben recorded it. "We built the process, they built the future." These classes were not held in textbooks alone. In Texas, German prisoners of war cultivated cotton beside American farmers. One Bavarian farm boy, Herbert Lang, watched a teenager drive a tractor worth more than Lang's father had ever made. Lang wrote, his father was waiting for the next model. We counted bullets. Our future was a machine. Theirs was this machine. Meanwhile, camp educational programs formalized the shift. Certificates in English, vocational training, correspondence courses from the University of Chicago and Stanford University, orchestrated for men who had sworn allegiance to a regime built on myth, hierarchy, and suppression. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm Braun, former researcher at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, wrote, "They taught what we never learned and expected nothing in return." A former prisoner recalled, "I volunteered for every class. I wanted to know. Before I believed we were winners. Then I believed we were fools." As the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the physical fences began to open, but the mental ones cracked long before. More than 371,000 German POWs passed through U.S. camps. In the aftermath, surveys indicated fewer than 1% attempted permanent escape. Around 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. JSTOR.org +1. When repatriation commenced in 1946, these men carried more than military fatigues home. They carried impressions, ideas, models of what was possible. Hans Kroll, a former POW at Camp Shelby, wrote, "We came as conquerors. We left with ideas." Many later emigrated to the U.S., maintained correspondence with American families, or worked in industries built on the factories they once observed. usgarrelations.traces.org. Their experience became a silent underground current powering the reconstruction of West Germany. Ideas seeded in barbed wire compounds blossomed into the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s. Factories built for war converted to peace. Fields plowed by POWs recycled into civilian harvests. Men once enemies became agents of rebuilding. In March 1946, a convoy of former POWs boarded transport ships, not heading toward defeat, but toward orientation courses in Germany. Lectures on free enterprise, worker rights, democratic governance, administered by the same U.S. Army that once counted them as prisoners. The transformation was real, if understated. One former officer wrote, "We had been told we were masters of the world. Behind our back, the world was building. We returned with open eyes. The legacy of this period is profound. The U.S. POW experience is unlike many others. While combat, starvation, and death haunted POWs everywhere, in America the captivity paradoxically offered a window into a world. The captives had been taught to loathe, and through that window they began to question. The POWs saw the might of American production. They also saw the dignity of American civility. They saw the power of democracy in action, factories, farms, free speech, optional labor, and they left changed." By 1947, dozens of former German POWs who had once been SS candidates, Hitler Youth officers, tank crewmen, or artillerymen were now Harvard-bound students, farm managers, emigrants. They carried with them the architecture for a society that defeated not just Nazi Germany, but the idea of Nazi superiority. Their presence in post-war Germany shaped politics, industry, even culture. The narratives of reconstruction, efficiency, labor dignity, consumer abundance, echoed the scenes they had witnessed behind American fences. The lesson was unexpected. The strongest weapon of victory was not an explosion over Berlin, but a seam-welded steel plant in Ohio, a cotton gin in Texas, a packing house in Nebraska. This chapter reminds us, victory is not only about defeating an enemy, it's about showing a better way. For the German POWs, America didn't just beat them, it enlightened them. And that enlightenment rippled across decades and continents. As we reflect on these stories, remember that the greatest transformations are not always loud. Sometimes they're quiet. Sometimes they happen when a man stops believing he's superior and begins believing in possibility. Sometimes they happen when the prisoner becomes a pioneer, the captive becomes a citizen, the enemy becomes a partner. In the end, the war these men fought didn't end at 11 o'clock on May 8, 1945. It ended for them earlier, when the lights stayed on, when the machines didn't stop, when America showed not just power, but purpose. And in that, the ghosts of World War II found their true enemy, not defeat, but disbelief. They stepped off the trains, stepped into the fields, into the factories, into a country at war that still seemed at peace, and by doing so, they became part of something far larger than battles, far larger than borders. The German POWs, who found themselves in America during the closing years of World War II, did not simply survive. They witnessed transformation. They watched a nation's production lines roar, its farms feed millions, its towns glow at night. And in that witness, they became unwilling participants in one of the most profound moral and industrial victories of the 20th century. Here in America, families saw to their care. Civilians shared food, churches welcomed strangers, and everyday men and women stepped into history by treating enemies not as faceless foes, but as human beings. For family members of veterans, those who served abroad, those who returned home worn and changed, this story is a mirror, a reminder that wars leave wounds, yes, but they also leave opportunities for understanding, for connection, for a new peace built on shared humanity. Think of the veteran in your life, the one who carried a uniform, an experience, a story. Perhaps he didn't witness the POW camps, but he lived through the same era. He saw ration cards, saw letters from home, saw ships crossing oceans, and the distant horizon of victory approach. He heard the roar of production lines, the thunder of factories repurposed for peace. In his footsteps marched not only soldiers, but machines. Yes, but also ideas. The German prisoners watched those ideas in action. They saw that abundance, even during war, is not frivolous. They saw that kindness did not equal weakness. They saw that a factory belt running non-stop could mean more than a bomber squadron flying overhead. And when they returned home, they carried memory, not hatred. Many returned and helped rebuild Germany. Many found themselves grateful for what they had witnessed. One former POW visited his old U.S. camp decades later and said simply, "Thank you, America. Army.mil+1." To the families of veterans, imagine what it must have meant for your father, grandfather, great-uncle to come home, to look at the world he helped preserve, and to see someone else's captured soldier made human. To him, that might have been the most confusing, the most humbling, the most hopeful sight of all. The man who once fought to dominate saw the other side being dominated by productivity, by kindness, by an industrial and moral strength. This channel exists to honor those stories. The pilots, the tank crews, the infantry, the secret ops, the factories, the farms, the invisible fronts, but also the aftermath. Because history isn't only what happened, it's how we remember it, how we teach it, how we carry it forward. And for veterans and their families, remembering means more than recalling. It means connecting. If your loved one served in World War II or later, and you've heard a story passed down, maybe it mentioned war machines, maybe fields, maybe factories, think of this. That story might link to what happened behind barbed wire in America, or to what happened on the front lines, or to what your country built at home so they could fight abroad. It's a story of service, it's a story of witnessing, and it's a story of humanity. So now, if you're moved by what you've just heard, let's take action together. Like this video, if you believe stories of valor and humanity deserve to be told. Comment below with a single word, forge. Because just like the machines of the wartime era that forged tanks, tractors, bombs, and then peace, we forge memory, we forge connection, we forge legacy. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tap the bell so you never miss the next chapter in our Ghosts of World War II series. To veterans, your sacrifice made possible more than victory. It made a world rebuild. To families, your stories keep alive not just the fight, but the purpose. To our audience, thank you for caring enough to watch these stories and to carry them beyond this screen. In closing, the engines of war stopped, but the engines of memory keep turning. The fields once worked by prisoners are now fields of harvest. The factories that supplied machines now supply lives. The men who came as enemies left as witnesses, and the veterans who fought, their legacy presses on through us. As you reflect on the stories you've heard here today, take a moment to reach out to your veteran, your family member, your neighbor who served. Ask them what they remember. Ask them not just about the battles, but about the silence after the guns, the factories after the bombs, the men behind the fences, and the families beyond. Because history is not just behind us, history lives in us. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video of Ghosts of World War II. And remember, when the machines stop, the memory should not.